everybody to another edition of Let's Do Lunch. Today is Thursday, so it is our Rights Tech Roundtable, and we have a terrific show today. Before I introduce our guests, let me remind you that we love to know who is here with us today. So please introduce yourselves in the chat. That is right on the bottom nav. And when you do make your intros, make sure to select all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your posts. When you have questions for the panel today, please put them in the Q&A button just to the left of the chat so that it's easier for our moderator panelists to get to all of your questions. We try to do that through the show today. As I mentioned, today is Rights Tech Roundtable, and we have an amazing entrepreneur with us today. Oscar Hoagland is co-founder and CEO of Epidemic Sound, and he will be joining Paul Sweeting, CEO of Concurrent Media, in a conversation shortly. But let me welcome Paul first to introduce our show. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Ned. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Do Lunch and the Rights Tech Roundtable. Glad you could all join us here today. Yes, we do have what I think is going to be a terrific conversation in store for you with Oscar. But before we get to that, I just wanted to flag, as usual, a couple of recent interesting headlines. There was this week, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down an important copyright ruling. Some were calling it the copyright case of the century, although the century is still relatively young. And in that case, the court found in favor of Google that Google had not infringed Oracle's copyright on a Java API. A lot of copyright experts were somewhat disappointed in the ruling in that the court did not reach the sort of underlying question of whether operation or functional code such as an API should be copyrightable in the first place, and instead ruled on the basis of fair use, claiming that Google was making a fair use. The court, for the sake of argument, assumed the copyrightability of the API, but decided that Google had made fair use of it in re-implementing that API as part of the Android operating system. Now, on its face, this doesn't necessarily seem to have much to do with what we typically deal with here at Rights Tech. It doesn't involve a media or entertainment player. Well, I guess Google is, but not in this context. But I do think it's worth noting because, first of all, the Motion Picture Association filed actually two amicus briefs, one, I believe, in conjunction with the Recording Industry Association, and one by itself at a different stage in the case, in which they urged the court not to decide the matter on fair use and not to find that it was fair use. And in particular, they were concerned that the court not declare what Google, the usage that Google made of the API to be transformative. That is going to which concerns the nature of the use, which is one of the four factors in traditional fair use analysis. And to their chagrin, I imagine, that's precisely what Justice Breyer did in his majority opinion, finding that Google's use of the API and of Oracle's copyright or presumed copyright was indeed transformative and therefore weighed in favor of fair use. Obviously, the MPAA, recording industry, a lot of copyright interests, want to keep the court's reading of transformative uses as narrow as possible to limit the number of cases that would be declared fair use. Another really potentially troubling aspect of the case or of the opinion by Breyer from the studio's point of view, from the MPA's point of view, is his analysis of its effect, Google's use, the effect of Google's use of the API on the market for Oracle, and the effect on the market is another critical piece of fair use analysis. And I'm not an attorney, so if there are attorneys in the audience who want to correct me on this, please put it in the chat or put it in the Q&A, and I'll try to address it later. That his analysis sort of looked at not just the effect of Google's use on the market for Oracle, but on the market more broadly, and concluded that if the court enforced the copyright for Oracle, it might preclude a number of subsequent innovative uses that would be, pro market and pro public interest. And so it was not, I don't think, a very good ruling for the sort of copyright interests that we deal with here at RightsTech. Another notable headline I saw this week was the statement by Nat Zilka, partner at KKR, major private equity investment firm. And 2 weeks ago, KKR and BMG announced a $1 billion fund that they were jointly creating for the purpose of acquiring music copyrights. And this week, Mr. Zilka said, actually, the $1 billion is just a starting point, and that there is, and I quote, no upper limit on the capital that they're willing to spend and invest in the pursuit of music rights. So clearly, the appetite for music and music rights within the traditional investment community is not diminishing. And that brings us to our discussion for today. And I'd like to invite Oscar to join us. There he is. Hi, Oscar.
Hey, Paul. Hey, everyone.
As Ned mentioned, Oscar is the founder and CEO of, or co-founder and CEO of Epidemic Sound, which itself just raised $450 million US dollars at a valuation of 1.4 billion, which was led by two other major private equity investment firms, Blackstone being one and EQT Capital being the other. So I'm very thrilled to have Oscar here today. Before we get into the discussion, let me give you a little of his background. He's actually had a 20-year career in or more in as an entrepreneur. He's launched a number of different startups over that time, and since 2009, he's been leading Epidemic as the CEO, and is been responsible for driving the company's expansion strategy, which is now likely to be notably more robust with 450 million in his back pocket. And he prior to that, he did a stint at a leading TV production studio in Sweden, known as Zodiac Television, and he joins us today from Stockholm, where it is the middle of the night, practically. So, Oscar, thanks for staying up late.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. This is coffee, so I hope everyone is enjoying lunch somewhere in the world. Here in Sweden, it's dark and it's cold and it's snowing, and we're enjoying coffee. So happy to join you.
Is it snowing there still?
We had a snowstorm the other day, so it's 0 degrees centigrade, and don't ask me to translate it to Fahrenheit because that just gets complicated. It's cold.
32 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it's very cold.
So let's start with the basics. Give folks the sort of a lot of people here are probably familiar with Epidemic, but for those who may not be, give us the elevator pitch of what Epidemic does.
You bet. I know for a fact that quite a few people are familiar because I've seen some familiar faces and names pop into the chat, which is great. To explain Epidemic, I would take a step back and say that Epidemic has been around for the better part of a decade, 12 years to be more precise. And it stems from a very clear idea of how we would like to contribute. And Epidemic focuses on the internet, basically. We firmly believe that it's our generation's defining moment. It's what my grandkids are going to look up to me at some point and say, "Granddad, is it true that your generation invented the internet?" And there's going to be a big old smile on my face, and I'm going to go, "Yep, that was on us." And then we know, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that grandkids, or at least my grandchild, probably will say at some point, but Granddad, how did you help create the internet? What was your role? Because please tell me that you contributed. And what we've decided we want to say at Epidemic is that we want to say that, yeah, we got to soundtrack the internet. That was part of our contribution. So summing up Epidemic, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help soundtrack our generation's biggest collective achievement. That may sound like a, maybe not trivial, but a very straightforward pursuit. But mark my words, it's very, very complicated. It's taken over a decade, and it's a big vision. It's a big vision that sort of asks a lot from us and from the people that we work with. And we're now at the stage where 12 years in, we're a company where we've built a catalog, and our customers have subscriptions with us, and they use our music to bring their fantastic stories to life. Our customers are in the millions all around the world, and they're the Netflix of the world, and they're the YouTubers and everyone in between. That's the elevator pitch.
And describe how you make this music available. I mean, it's not, you have a somewhat unusual model for allowing the use of this music that you acquire from a roster of how many music creators would you say you're working with at Epidemic?
So I would say that over the course of the last 12 years, we're talking about tens of thousands of music creators. At any given time, though, it's more in the hundreds. And I think that the model that we've created, in order to explain it, I think Churchill put it quite well. Allegedly, he said once that I don't have time to write a short email, so I'm going to write a very long email. I'm going to attempt to do the opposite, to try and explain what we've done in maybe 3 bullet points. So the 1, 2, 3 of Epidemic and how we came to do what we do is we have this very clear vision. We want to, so the one is a one vision company. So we want to soundtrack the internet. And that stems from, I think, back in the day, as you alluded to it, initially, I was in TV production, and together with my other co-founders, we stumbled upon 2 problems. One problem was from a production point of view that adding music to television is crucial, right? So it's a bit like adding taste to food. So music is instrumental in making the experience come to life and making it memorable. But it was wildly complicated. Understanding who held what rights, how to pay for something, report it, clear it, administer it. The tools were at best bleak. And something that we felt passionately ought to be the most fun part of content creation, when you add music, when you cross your T's and you dot your I's, was something that you were afraid to do because there was no upside. It was all downside protection. And you were terrified of your content actually doing well because you knew that without a shadow of a doubt, if your content became viral, terrible thought, and you were successful, music rights would probably be an issue because there was going to be one platform, one use case, one right, one sync, one performance society that you hadn't cleared for, and that was going to come back and cause trouble. So that was one sort of part of the equation that needed solving. The other part that needed solving was from a music producing perspective. There was this disconnect between putting in the hours of being a talented musician and trying to create a track and getting paid. There was this solid belief that royalty was the answer to everything. And royalty may be the answer to a lot, but it's not the answer to everything, because it turned out that a huge amount of people who put in the hours, who made the music, they never saw the royalty come their way. It either didn't get reported correctly, the track didn't get picked up or used, or along the way it kind of trickled down and it amounted to a meager meh. And so there was a disconnect between sort of getting paid from the music side. And so we saw these two problems. How can we make soundtracking content fun? And how can we help sustain and support musicians? And so the two of them came together into the vision, which was let's soundtrack the internet. And Swedes are surprisingly mediocre at basically everything. You might laugh, but sort of I would argue that's the case. But we do have a few superpowers. One of them is that we have a solid engineering background. So throughout the years, we've built the Atlas Copcos, the Ericssons, the Volvos, the Saabs. We're deep in engineering, and we've honed in on those skills. And you now equate companies like Spotify or Minecraft or Klarna or iSettle or SoundCloud. And so one of our superpowers, one of the reasons we felt that we were well positioned to take on this big vision to soundtrack the internet was that we felt very comfortable that through technology, through innovation, obviously deeply inspired by Daniel and Martin and sort of other great entrepreneurs before us who ventured into the music space, we felt that this is something where we feel comfortable. The other superpower that we possessed relates to IP and is music-wise. So between the Aviciis and the Abbas, between the Jenny Linds and the Monica Zetterlunds and the sort of Swedish music exports, we're very talented when it comes to producing music. So we leaned into these two superpowers, and we felt confident 12 years ago that so we can start to hack away at this vision, at this dream, and start to use these two superpowers to create the fundament of our business. Which leads us to the three, which is what we set off to do is we set off to try and solve for three problems. If you want to soundtrack the internet, if you want to lean into the superpowers, there are three different sets of problems that need solving. And the first one related to musicians. And it was a question of how do you help musicians get played and get paid? So that was the problem that needed solving. And the current best thinking back then was that it was, in order to solve for those challenges, it was in the musician's best interest to keep all of the rights as close to their own body as possible. Don't part with your rights. And this is where we placed this huge contrarian bet 12 years ago, where we bet against the trend. And we said that we actually think it's the other way around. We think that the best way that we can help to pay and support musicians and make sure that we can distribute and get their music played as much as possible is if we commission tracks and if we acquire copyrights. So we do full out buyout and we acquire for tracks up front. So we came up with this very new hybrid model. We had trouble coming up with a good name because the term royalty free, which gets used time and time again, is a very bleak term and it doesn't really explain what we're doing. So what we call our model is we call it restriction free music because the music can travel across platforms, across time zones, across international boundaries. And sort of its intent, its purpose is to help bring stories to life. In order to solve for that, we had to be very creative and very entrepreneurial in terms of understanding what does the legal environment look like and what does the business case look like. So we came up with a new way of paying musicians and artists. Some of it's old, some of it's new, but the composition of how we put it together, I would argue, is quite different. So step one is that we said, let's make sure that we pay every single time when we commission a track, we're going to be paying up front, anywhere between $1,000 to $5,000, depending on complexity, time, composition. So let's put our money where our mouth is and not ask musicians to take the risk or take the plunge. This is not a recoup, it's an actual transaction. So regardless if the track never gets used, that's step one in the transaction. Step two is we said that as we then distribute this music to our generation's most prolific storytellers, customers are now in the millions, their viewers are in the billions. So the music starts to play and reach billions of viewers who over time transform and become listeners. And so we started to see this interesting knock-on effect where as we were soundtracking the internet, people were falling in love with our music, with our artists, and with the tracks. And they were shazamming them. And the number one question across YouTube was, I love this track. Why can't I find it on Apple or on Spotify or on Deezer? And so we uploaded all of the tracks to all of the different DSPs. And then that started to generate royalty, obviously. So billions of viewers were becoming marketeers and were being transformed into listeners. And when they listened on the DSPs, they generated millions of dollars in royalties. So we would collect all of those royalties. And we took a long, hard look at the industry and we saw how would this typically get distributed? And it turned out that it would get shifted and sort of allocated between a ton of different middlemen. There would be publishers, PRO, neighboring rights organizations, record labels. So a lot of people who are part of the value chain, but a very small portion of it arguably ended up in the pockets of actual music creators and artists. Because we had opted out for not having any middlemen, so we could sort of rebuild that model. I'm going to pause there.
Yeah. So you don't, you don't use any collection society, CMO, PRO to actually collect the royalties that that are earned on the music that you've distributed to the DSPs. Correct? You do that yourself directly. How does that actually work?
Yeah. So if we look at the DSPs, that's entirely correct, Paul. We're in a position where we commission tracks directly from musicians. We pay up front and we put them in our catalog and we put them on our service, our website. We then also sort of parallel publish them across all DSPs. I think we currently work with about 40 different DSPs. And then when these tracks get played across DSPs, they pay out royalties directly to us. And we then split these royalties 50-50 directly with the music creators. And so we're in a position where we've chosen not to go through the services of performance rights organization or neighboring rights organizations. We do that directly. And
the DSPs were cool with that when you approached them with this model. I mean, they already have deals in place and longstanding relationships with the traditional CMOs and PROs. So was it difficult to convince them that that there was this alternative model?
No, I would argue that it wasn't, because I think that what we stand for is sort of a complement. I think that there have been voices raised arguing that we are very disruptive, but I wouldn't call us disruptive as much as we're complementary. We're ultimately seeing an increasing pie. We're seeing more and more money sort of end up in the music ecosystem across DSPs, across VSPs. We're seeing consumption basically across the globe just explode. And as the pie is increasing, I think that a lot of the different people within the value chain are seeing choice, and anyone who adds sort of a multitude of different offerings for music creators and content creators adds value, because it makes the ecosystem richer, it makes it more diverse, and ultimately, so I think it helps to create a much more interesting internet.
So you've talked about commissioning works directly from artists. Tell us a little bit more about that process. What do you simply go out and commission works from artists that you like or have worked with before, or do you have sort of specific? Do you have are there users of music who are requesting specific types of tracks? Tell us about that process.
I'd love to. So I'm not going to be as long-winded this time. So let's take a step back first. So our customers are in the millions. And just to give you a sense of the scale we're at now, I'd say 2 years ago, our music was played on average about 250 million hours a month on YouTube alone. That number today is roughly about 1 billion hours per month of music that we soundtrack on YouTube alone. So the scale we're at now is quite substantial. I think we power maybe 85% of all of the planet's multi-channel networks, so the maker studios and the full screens and the like. And I think we soundtrack roughly about 60% of the world's largest 100 YouTube channels. So we're at a point where I feel quite optimistic about talking to grandkids going forward about soundtracking the internet. But that said, when we commission track, the reason I bring all of this up is because data plays a huge part. So typically how things work out is that if we were working together with you, Paul, we would commission a track. We would send you a brief and saying, Paul, we think you're an exceptional Afrobeats producer. We've heard the stuff that you've submitted to us. And so here are references. This is what we're looking for. And you might say, this is wildly inspiring. It's sort of odd you should ask this. This is exactly what I feel like doing. So you have a specific A&R counterpart at Epidemic. We have a team of more than 50 A&Rs who have hundreds of years between them of A&R experience. And we would typically do 2, 3, 4 different feedback rounds over the course of anything of like a month, up to 3 to 4 months, sometimes longer than that. Eventually we get to a point where we think the track is outstanding and sort of pay you up front. And then we put that track in our catalog. And when we do that, it gets exposed to our generation's most prolific storytellers. So tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of content creators might be picking your track up straight off the bat, Paul, because we push it, we understand what they're looking for, and we help it surface in the right place. That, because it's music, it leaves a footprint. And as it starts to soundtrack content all across the world, in real time, we have access to data, we have a graph, so we can see exactly what the internet sounds like because we're at that scale. So we collect all of these signals, we collect all of that data, and then we come back to you, Paul, and we go, we commissioned 2 tracks from you. The first track, total miss, but the second track was an absolute hit, and especially so in Latin America. So we
let me stop you there for 1
second.
second. How much of that data do you then share with the musician? Do they what do they?
Substantial part of it.
Substantial part of it.
So there are 2 parts to why that data is so important. On the one hand, the data in itself informs us and the music creators what part of their productions, what part of their catalogs is getting picked up. So it helps inform them. It helps them hone in, saying that, the music I'm producing here is doing very well, it's traveling well, I should probably double down and do more of this. So we've created this instant feedback loop because the scale we're at now, we can immediately see, because we have technology meeting creativity, we've created feedback loops so you can see how your content is doing. And so that makes it easier for us to commission tracks, but it makes it also much more rewarding if you're a music creator, because the second part of the data is when you get that data back, you understand how your track is doing, you understand what revenue you're going to be generating, what are the streams, what are the different DSPs who are picking it up. So it also helps inform sort of your ability to generate revenue and to sustain yourself. So the data plays some 2 very important roles. So one is from a creative aspect, and the other one is from a sustainable, so financial perspective.
Tell us about, I mean, in Europe, and actually there was a question from Tally Firazin. Sorry, Tally, probably made a mess of that. Noting that, in particularly in European countries, there are, exclusive PROs. So what is the actual sort of legal situation that you're in with respect to, acting as the essentially the collecting society?
Yeah. So the way that breaks down is that when you look at agreements, typically when you decide to become affiliated with the collecting society, they are constructed in a way so that when you sign that, you are under obligation to make sure that everything you produce has to fall under the mandate of a PRO. So effectively, it's an either you're with us or you're against us agreement. And as a consequence of that, we don't work with music creators who are affiliated to PROs simply because their underlying agreement doesn't allow for it. If you flip it around and you ask me, what about your agreement, Oscar? They're the exact opposite. We do not like exclusivity. We don't believe in tying people in. We acquire tracks on a per asset basis. And we feel that people should be around and work for us because they want to, not because they're obliged by an agreement. So that's sort of how it breaks down. And there are certain jurisdictions where, I think North America is a great example, where you can do buyouts and where you sort of can opt to have certain parts of your repertoire outside of your underlying agreements. But from a practical perspective, that doesn't scale globally because, as to your point, Paul, a lot of the other PROs around the world and the collecting societies in Europe, they have bilateral agreements and they don't acknowledge that there is a per track buyout. Hence, they collect on the entire repertoire if the person in question is registered with a PRO. Hence, in practice, it doesn't work. So that's why we don't work with any music composers who are parts of PROs, because it simply would be a breach of their underlying agreement with their PROs. Consequence of that being, we're seeing tons of people leaving PROs because they want to work with us in parallel. If you ask me, I think that would probably be the best setup, where music creators could have some tracks with PROs and some tracks where they sell 100% of the rights.
So have you been able to gather or analyze sort of an A/B case for a musician as to what their earnings would be or could be under your model as opposed to a traditional CMO PRO model? I mean, is there hard data on that, or is it too?
Yeah, I think it's always difficult when you generalize. He said, and then he went on to generalize. But I believe the last number that I've come across, or that we've come across, I think that music creators North America, I think on average make about $21,000 per year. The average music creator at Epidemic Sound makes north of $35,000 per year. And the top earners within our ecosystem make hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. So I think it's fair to say that if you look at averages, we're like 2x what the average is. And I think it feeds into the fact that sort of our business is very much geared towards, we want to help music creators soundtrack the internet. So as long as you're interested in seeing your music travel and bring content to life, so our place is this incredible accelerator where we marry distribution with production, and then sort of based on technology, we can see that scale and sort of travel all across the world.
Now, are there any territories where you're not able to operate because of whatever the local regulations are regarding PROs, CMOs? I mean, a week or so ago, we had on Jordi Puy from Unison in Barcelona, which is a sort of new form of PRO or CMO, although it's not classified as a CMO, it's classified as an independent, I forget what the exact term, but it was something established by a EU directive back in 2014, and independent management entity or something like that. And they've been growing, and it's interesting in that they run their business on blockchain, but there are territories, he said, where they're not able to operate because they are not a official national CMO.
So I think the way I would go about to answer that question is that if I were to vastly simplify, I would say that there are two different user cases. So one is acquiring rights, so as in acquiring IP, and the other one is distributing them, as in seeing them used. And with regards to the former, so acquiring IP cannot be done in all territories across the world because there are national boundaries and sort of differences in terms of how you can acquire copyrights. So in some jurisdictions, it's simply not possible. The flip side is, from a distribution perspective, however, it is. The nature of the internet is that it doesn't really live under national boundaries. It's global in its very nature. It's a distributed network. So in terms of distributing globally, that's absolutely fine. But acquiring IP is something which is remarkably complicated, and it's something that needs a lot of understanding before you can go ahead and acquire copyrights at scale.
Interesting. So I wanted to go circle back a little bit to some of the basics of your business. Where is Epidemic's growth coming from primarily? Are there particular categories of video or particular platforms that are, or particular use cases that are generating your growth or driving your growth more so than others?
So the short answer is yes, all of the above. And the somewhat longer answer is that I am absolutely convinced that in a room somewhere 20 years ago, there were two people similar to yourself and I, Paul, where one person was trying to persuade the other person, saying that, look, in 20 years' time, I believe that every company on the planet is going to have their own website. And the other person was just sort of hooking their head back and going, saying, you're crazy. That's never going to happen. It's really expensive for upkeep and sort of keeping that up and running. There's no way in hell. Maybe the Fortune 500 companies might have that, but not every company on the planet. And here we are 20 years later. Not only does every single company on the planet Earth have their own website, but every single individual on planet Earth has their own LinkedIn site, their own Facebook site, their own Twitter handle, their own Twitter account. So there's been this huge, not evolution, but revolution in terms of how the internet developed. And I feel equally convinced now that sort of within 5 years from now, I think that every single company on the planet is going to want to use video when they communicate with their stakeholders, with their employees, with their customers, with their suppliers, basically with anyone who's interested in sort of understanding what that company has to say. If I look at my social media feeds, if it's not video, it's not compelling. If it's not compelling, I'm not engaging, and I'm just sort of I'm flicking past it. I know, as an example, I think that Facebook last month had something like 140 million companies on Facebook in one given month on one platform in the year 2021. And they're all looking to connect with their key stakeholders. And so it's all moving to video. So I think that's sort of similar to the discussion 20 years ago. Everyone is switching to video, and all that video needs sound tracking. So we're seeing small companies, we're seeing medium companies, we're seeing enterprise. And on top of that, we're seeing the OGs. So the influencers, if you will, the content creators who are now in the tens of millions, pushing hundreds of millions, basically across a multitude of platforms. Many of these platforms who didn't even exist 2 years ago. So Clubhouse wasn't around 2 quarters ago. TikTok was hardly around 2 years ago, and the list goes on and on and on. So again, so going back to, I'm seeing all these platforms, I'm seeing all of these user cases. I'm thoroughly convinced, even more so now than we were 12 years ago, but back then, we knew without a shadow of a doubt that the internet was going to be initially a tech-centric medium. We then anticipated that it would evolve and be a picture-centric medium. But we knew without a shadow of a doubt that when technology allowed for it, the internet was going to be a video-centric medium, simply because video carries so much more information, it carries emotion, and it does so much more efficiently than all other forms. So it was only a question of time for us before technology and sort of the unleashing of creativity could happen. And I think that's one of the things that we got right early on, and we were able to position ourselves, as I alluded to. We solved for the musicians' problems. How do I get paid and how do I get played? We then solved for the content creators. How can I make sure that my content can travel across all platforms and music just works? I don't want to get sued. I want to tell beautiful stories. And the third one is we wanted to try and solve for future generations so that anyone basically can consume anything, anywhere. We don't want to create all these sort of first-rate citizens, second-rate citizens, where you can't consume content regardless of where you are. So you put all of that together, and I think that's the opportunity we're seeing. We're seeing an entire globe shift to a video-first business model, and it needs to be easy. That's what we're trying to solve for.
Okay, we're coming up on our time here. Before we get to questions, I wanted to put up a little audience poll that we have for folks out there. And while folks are filling out their poll, we had a few questions from the audience. An anonymous attendee asks, how does it affect cell phone quality? I'm not sure exactly what that is referring to. I'm not sure, Tali, did we answer your question fully? The musicians you're working with are not registered with PROs. Well, I think we just covered that.
Hope so.
And the exclusivity issue, I think we've addressed. Another, or perhaps the same anonymous attendee asks, Does transparent data mean a subscriber's user contact information?
Does transparent data mean a subscriber's user contacts? No, it doesn't. Yeah, short answer is no. GDPR, obviously, that would not be compliant. Transparent data means serving back to music creators how many times their music gets played, across what platforms, in what different context. So it's more aggregated than on an individual level, and it definitely doesn't involve subscriber user contact information.
Now, do you have any sort of exclusivity with the musicians that you're working with? I mean, would they are they entitled to or able to to work with other distributors of music so long as they stay away from the PRO?
Very much so. We actually encourage it because, again, as I alluded to, what's at the center of what we're trying to solve for, the second part of the equation which was broken, is how can we help musicians sustain themselves? And so working with us is a great part of solving for that. But we don't claim to be the sole solution for everything. We encourage people to travel, to tour. Obviously, is different in 2020 and partially in 2021, given the global pandemic we're all in. But I think that working with multiple collaborators is a much more rewarding way of working. We see people who only work with us as well, and so they're obviously free to do that as well. But it needs to be their choice. It needs to be how can we empower music creators and optimize for their outcome. And I just simply don't believe that coercion or exclusivity is the answer to that. You have to choose us time and time again.
Do you think, obviously based in Europe, the European Copyright Directive is coming into play this year, which is going to impose some new requirements on UGC platforms with respect to, looking for perhaps filtering out copyrighted works that are being used without a license. Do you think that's going to drive demand for your sort of service, that more creators would be looking for works that they don't have to worry about getting flagged?
It definitely wouldn't surprise me if that were one of the outcomes. I think that the nature of why these changes are being effectuated is that they're looking to empower content creators and to make sure that creators of content get fairly compensated, but at the same time making sure that sort of distribution of content still holds up and works. And I think that we are in that intersection. That's what we've been trying to solve for the last decade. So if anything, the changes put us in an even stronger position. I think they amplify and give us more, put more attention on the difficult nature of the problem that we need to solve. Because on the one hand, it's about looking out for the rights and the livelihoods of content creators, but that's in collaboration, and that only works if the content can travel and it reaches a big audience that generates a lot of attention and over time generates
and would it make sense from your perspective at any point to actually integrate with, say, a UGC platform where you're making your catalog available to folks on that platform?
I think the short answer there, Paul, is that we already are at scale. Our music is being used to power most of the large UGC platforms out there. Obviously not exclusively. We're sort of very set on being part of the solution. And so our music is already at scale on all of the different UGCs. And I think that if anything, the new regulation will help bring them all to par. I think that some of the platforms have got it very right, and some of them are still early days. And if anything, I think these new regulations will help usher them in sooner rather than later into a position where they're doing the right thing, and hopefully they're getting it more right than wrong.
Cody Allard asks, how do you foresee genre trends evolving over the following years, particularly in the UGC space? Will it follow broader industry trends, hip hop, rock, pop, or do you anticipate overrepresentation of certain niches, such as lo-fi or other areas of the electronic music spectrum?
I think that's a great question, Cody. I definitely side with the latter part of your question there. So I'm seeing an overrepresentation of certain niches, lo-fi, other areas of electronic music, definitely. Taking a step back, so when we look at 2020, I think there's this American term which is called comfort food, right? So when you're sad, you eat comfort food, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
It's not an exaggeration to say that the world has been sad 2020, and so we saw that materialize in not comfort food but in comfort music. So the listening habits of people all across the globe shifted quite dramatically. So we saw different kinds of music being played, uplifting, hopeful, peaceful, much more lo-fi, instrumental, almost meditative music. So I think that what the world is going through now very much resonates, and we're picking that up on the soundtrack of the internet. That trend, I think, has been fortified and sort of picked up and maybe amplified even more so by DSPs. If you look at sort of a couple of the world's largest DSPs and the different playlists that they're putting together and what's trending, we're seeing a shift towards more niche, more lo-fi, more other areas of music, which are now sort of having a second renaissance. So it's a complicated picture, and there's a lot of noise, because obviously on the one hand we have the mega trends, which is being pulled towards the mean, and things are becoming more popular, and it feels as though everyone is listening to Drake, and that can be true. Whilst at the same time we're seeing the proliferation of much more niche and much more other genres, other categories. Instrumental music is doing much better, I think, than many DSPs have ever would have assumed, and maybe this ties into storytellers. I read somewhere now that the majority of kids now, they don't want to be firefighters, they don't want to be rock stars. Rather, they want to be YouTubers. That's the number one desire for people. And it makes sense from the sense that I would argue that there probably are time's most prolific storytellers. And the music that they incorporate in their stories when they bring their content to life, typically somebody's talking over it, there's a narrative going on. You can't use traditional famous tracks because you get immediately blocked, you can't monetize. And so that narrative, that term of expression is fostering a new type of soundtracks, a new type of listening, which I think that we're tapping into to a large rate.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Before we go, I just want to put up the poll results. I wanted to get a sense of just who was in the audience, and it's pretty widely spread. We have artist representatives, rights owners, music users, intermediaries, everybody. It's a pretty diverse audience out there. What do you think is the biggest benefit to music users from and I apologize, I used the term royalty-free rather than restriction-free. All of the above was the most popular response, but the largest single response was ease of licensing.
I think that's a super fair point, because it ties into the whole democratization of content creation. Every 12-year-old is a content creator now, and so it needs to be easy. So it needs to be all of the above.
And ask the same question from the other end. What do you think? What's the biggest benefit to musicians from going with your sort of model? And again, all of the above, but the upfront payments was a popular idea, but also pretty spread out among the individual responses. Placement exposure, fair revenue splits, data, lack of PRO. Fees. Anything in that surprise you, Oscar?
No, I think that people have picked up that it's a combination of all of them. So providing upfront payments so you have certainty, so you can plan your life. Getting placement exposure, I think maybe is slightly under indexed, but that's because we haven't spoken about it. So the value of getting placements can't be underestimated, because I think that's
I apologize. I wanted to get to that point, but we didn't have the time. Yeah. So we have to leave it there. Tomorrow we'll be Let's Do Lunch. We'll be back with the business of music with Brady Sadler of Double Elvis, which is both a music and podcast company. And so that'll be at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Stockholm time. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions, and a special thanks to Oscar. This was fascinating. I'm really glad we were able to do it.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul, and thank you everyone for listening and taking time out of your lunch, I guess.
Okay, take care, everyone.